The house was quiet in a way that had weight to it. Rowan Decker stepped through the front door at 4:17 on a Tuesday afternoon, still wearing sawdust on his forearms from a 6-hour day restoring window casings on a Victorian in the East District. He set his keys on the hook by the door, the hook he had made himself from a single piece of walnut, 3 small branches shaped into curves by his own hands, and stood in the hallway and understood before he had moved another step that something had changed. He would not yell. He had never been a man who yelled. By Thursday morning, Cassandra's name would be on legal documents she had not anticipated. By the time she understood what she had walked away from, the number she thought she had taken would be the smallest number in the room. But first, the hallway. The bedroom closet stood open. Her side was bare, not the way a closet looked when someone traveled, clothes thinned out and the good bags missing. The way it looked when a decision had been made and carried out methodically, over time, everything taken that mattered and only the empty space remaining. Even the hangers were gone. She had taken the hangers. He walked to the bathroom. Her things were cleared from the counter. The little shelf above the sink where she kept the bottles, he had never learned the names of that shelf, was empty, wiped down, leaving a clean line of tile that had been dusty behind the bottles. She had planned this. He walked back through the bedroom, through the living room, into the kitchen. A single sheet of paper on the counter, folded once. His name on the outside in her handwriting, clean and careful the way she wrote everything. He did not open it yet. He picked up his phone. He opened the banking app for their joint checking account. Then the savings. He read the number. $412. $6 months of withdrawals he had not noticed, not because he was careless but because he had trusted her completely, small amounts scattered across the months. $800 here, $1,200 there, $2,400 in November that she had said was a car repair. The pattern was invisible until you stood at the end of it and looked back. $94,000. Gone. He set the phone face down on the counter. He picked up the letter. She had written it the way she wrote everything, clearly in the right order without unnecessary words. She was sorry. She had tried and then she had stopped trying and then too much time had passed. She had made mistakes that couldn't be unmade. She was going to stay with her sister for a while. She wished him well. She did not mention Preston Vale's name. Rowan set the letter down. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then he went to the workshop. It took him 11 months to understand what had been in front of him, not because the clues were hidden, but before he could see what was there, it helps to know what he had believed was there. Rowan Decker had worked with his hands since he was 8 years old. His father had been a repairman in the old sense of the word, a man who could fix a furnace, rebuild a porch, set a door that had warped out of true. Not glamorous work, not profitable work, but the kind of work that left things better than you found them, which his father said was the only definition of useful that held up over time. Rowan had grown up in that school of thought without consciously enrolling. He had simply been there, watching his father's hands move over materials, learning through proximity what patience and precision produced. By the time he was 14, he could square a door frame by eye. By the time he was 22, he was doing finish work on residential renovations that contractors twice his age would refer him for because his eye was better than theirs. He had not been rich. He had never been poor. He had been in the specific way that useful people were, comfortable enough that money was not the center of his thinking. This, apparently, had been visible from a distance. He had not understood that about Cassandra in the beginning. What he had seen was someone genuinely capable and driven, someone who had built herself from nothing, who was not afraid of work or of saying clearly what she thought. He had admired that. He had admired it without qualification, the way you admired a tool that was exactly right for its purpose. The first 3 years were good years. He could say this without sentiment and with accuracy. They had built a household that functioned. They had traveled twice, once to Portugal, once to the Pacific Northwest, both trips planned by Cassie with the precision she applied to everything. They had dinner parties where she was the room's center of gravity, and he had been happy to stand at its edge, watching her, feeling the specific pleasure of being the person who went home with someone like that. He had not noticed the temperature changing until the change was already complete. The second year had been busier for him. The business was growing in ways he had not fully anticipated, and he had spent more hours at the workshop and on job sites than he had in the first year of their marriage. He had tried to compensate, he was conscientious about this, brought her to client dinners when she was willing, set aside Sundays, but the balance had shifted, and he knew it had shifted, and he had filed it under temporary and told himself that once the business found its floor, things would level. He was not wrong that things would level. He was wrong about what he meant by things. The third year he noticed she was spending more time with her work colleagues. This was not unusual. Her firm was demanding, and the social life of a law office was its own ecosystem. She mentioned names he had not heard before. She came home from work functions later. He did not examine it. He trusted her. He had decided to trust her the same way he had decided to marry her, and he was not a man who reversed his decisions. He had not noticed the wine glass. He had not noticed the guest towel. He had not noticed the particular angle of her phone at dinner, or the calls she took in the car before she came inside, or the way her laugh had changed in quality when they were alone together. Less the open, unguarded one he had married, more a polite approximation of it. He had been paying attention to the work, which was the truest thing about him, and also in those years the thing that had cost him. Not because the clues were hidden. Because he had been doing what he always did, putting his head down, doing the work, trusting that the structure around him was as sound as the ones he built with his hands. He had met Cassandra 7 years ago at a mutual friend's dinner. She was a paralegal at a property law firm downtown, sharp and funny, with a way of listening that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. He had liked her immediately without examining why. She had grown up poor. He learned that early. Not poverty with dramatic edges, but the grinding, anxious kind. The kind where you checked the bank account before you bought groceries and understood from childhood that money was the thing standing between your family and humiliation. She had worked for everything she had, finished her paralegal certification while waitressing, paid off debt before she spent anything extra, and arrived in her early 30s with a fierce, clear-eyed relationship to financial security that Rowan had admired. He understood it. He had grown up modestly himself, the son of a man who fixed things for a living and taught his son that craftsmanship was its own kind of currency. His father had never been wealthy, but he had never once been desperate because his hands made things that lasted and people paid for things that lasted. Rowan had taken that lesson and built it into a business. Decker Restoration was 7 years old. He had started it with Gil Santos, who had the same kind of hands, the same patient attention to the materials and the methods. They did structural and finish carpentry on historic properties, the kind of work that required specialized knowledge of 19th century joinery and original material preservation. The kind of work that most contractors turned down because it was slow and demanding. The kind of work that only a specific client wanted done right and would pay accordingly. The business had grown quietly, the way sound structures grew, no sudden leaps, just steady accumulation of reputation and repeat clients. By year 3, Decker Restoration was booked 6 months out. By year 5, they had turned down more work than they took and added 2 additional craftsmen to the team. Cassie had called it his hobby work. Not mockingly, exactly. She had said it with the tone of mild affection, the way you referred to something that mattered to a person you loved, even if you didn't quite understand the scale of it. She had her own income, her own career at the firm, and she had never been particularly interested in the business side of what Rowan did. She knew he made things from wood. She knew he was good at it. She had come to the workshop exactly twice in 7 years. She had no idea what the business was worth. She had no idea about the courthouse contract. The Hargrove County Courthouse was a registered historic landmark, built in 1888 from hand-laid sandstone and original growth timber, and it had been waiting for a restoration team with the credentials and the patience to bring it back correctly for 11 years. The county had approached Decker Restoration 3 months before Cassie left. The contract was for $380,000 over 18 months, which was the largest single project Decker had ever taken on, and it would establish the firm as one of the premier historic restoration operations in the state. Rowan had not told Cassie about it yet. He had been waiting for the right moment. He had been planning to take her to dinner, to show her the blueprints, to show her what quiet work over many years produced when you stayed patient and kept your standards. She left on a Tuesday. The contract had been signed on the Monday before. The workshop smelled like cedar and linseed oil and the particular mineral smell of freshly worked stone. Rowan sat at his bench in the early evening with both hands flat on the surface of a piece of white oak he had been finishing for a client's entryway panel, and he stayed there without working, just staying. Gil came in at 7. He had a key. He always had a key. He looked at Rowan. He looked at the beer on the edge of the bench, still sealed. He pulled a stool from the corner and sat down. "She leave," he said. "She left." Gil nodded slowly. He didn't ask if Rowan was okay. He had known Rowan for 22 years, and he understood that asking if Rowan was okay when something was clearly not okay was a form of condescension. "Bank account," Gil said. Rowan told him the number. Gil was quiet for a moment. He picked up the sealed beer and opened it and handed it across the bench. Rowan took it. "How long?" Gil asked. "6 months of withdrawals, maybe more before that I haven't tracked. She was planning." "She was planning," Gil nodded. He stood, went to the small refrigerator in the corner, got his own beer and came back. "What do you need?" "Right now I need to sit here." "Okay." They sat. The workshop settled around them. The familiar sounds of a building that had been used hard for years. The creak of the old timber frame. The low hum of the dust collection system that Gil had never figured out how to silence. Rowan had owned this building for 3 years. He had bought it from a man who was closing a millwork shop, paid cash from the business's reserve account, and converted it into a workshop that he had built piece by piece with his own hands over 6 months. It was worth considerably more than the $412 in the joint account. Cassandra did not know about the building. It had never come up. "She know about the courthouse contract?" Gil asked. "No." Gil took a long pull of his beer. "Preston Vale," he said. It was not a question. Rowan looked at him. "I've had his name in the back of my mind for about a year." Gil set the bottle down. "I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to say something that wasn't sure." "Where did you hear it?" "Dan Holly's. He does tile work, comes in contact with a lot of brokers. Said Vale had been seen at a few places where Cassie's firm handles property work. The way Dan described it, it wasn't professional." Gil shrugged once. "That's all I had. I should have said something." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "You had instinct and rumor. That's not enough. It is now. Now it's different." He finished the beer. He set the bottle down on the bench beside the white oak panel, and he looked at the grain of the wood in the workshop light, the way it ran through the piece at a slight angle that he had spent an afternoon deciding how to orient. The grain would carry the load correctly only if you understood which direction it ran and respected it. He thought about $94,000. He thought about a woman who had grown up terrified of poverty, who had spent 7 years next to a man she saw as a carpenter who dabbled in old houses, who had apparently decided at some point that the smart play was to build a door out before everything fell through. She had built toward the wrong understanding of what was there. "I'm going to need an attorney," Rowan said. "Yeah," Gil said. "And I'm going to need everything I can find out about Preston Vale's business history before I see one." Gil nodded. He reached for his phone. "I'll call Dan in the morning." Margaret Holt had been a family law attorney for 31 years before she retired to an 1890s farmhouse 14 miles outside the city and hired Decker Restoration to spend a year putting it back to what it had been. She was 72 years old with white hair she wore pinned up, reading glasses she was always setting down in places she could not find them, and the particular clarity of a woman who had spent 3 decades in courtrooms where clarity was the only currency that mattered. She came to the workshop on a Thursday morning, not for the job. Her project was ongoing and on schedule, but because Gil had called her the night before and said Rowan needed a conversation with someone who understood the law. She set a thermos of coffee on the end of the bench and pulled a stool up without being asked. "Tell me what happened," she said. Rowan told her. He laid it out in order, The date he came home, the empty closet, the letter, the bank account, the 6 months of withdrawals he had traced, the number. He told her about the business, about the workshop building, about the courthouse contract. He told her what Gil had heard about Preston Vale. Margaret listened without interrupting. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the thermos, set one near Rowan's hand, held hers, and listened until he was done. "How long were you married?" she asked. "4 years. What is your best estimate of the business's current valuation?" Rowan had gone through the numbers with Gil the night before. He quoted her the figure: the equipment, the building, the outstanding contracts, the established client relationships. When he said it out loud, the number was larger than he had ever heard himself say before in connection with his own work. Margaret looked at her coffee cup. She said, "She worked as a paralegal at a property law firm. She understands asset structures." A pause. "The withdrawals are systematic, not impulsive. Whoever advised her and someone advised her they did it to stay below the threshold that would trigger automatic bank notification." "Yes. And the man she left for? Preston Vale. He's in real estate brokerage. Residential and commercial. Gil is finding out more." Margaret nodded slowly. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I want to be direct with you about something, and I want you to hear it carefully." "Go ahead." "The business is your primary asset, and it is clean. I say that as someone who has seen a great many cases where business assets were not clean, where there was commingling and confusion and legitimate disputation. Your business has separate accounts, separate tax identity, and from what you've described, was founded and funded entirely from premarital and business-generated revenue. Cassandra's household income may have allowed you to invest business revenue rather than pull it as living expenses. That is the argument they will make." Rowan was quiet. "It is not a winning argument," Margaret said, "if the documentation is correct, but they will make it. And if she is working with someone who understands property law, they will make it loudly and specifically and in language designed to make you feel like you are on uncertain ground." She picked up her coffee. "You are not on uncertain ground. You just need someone who will stand on that ground clearly and without flinching." "Who do you recommend?" Margaret set down her cup. "I'm going to call Diane Ferris. She is meticulous. She does not lose asset disputes, and she handles 2 cases a month involving male founders whose domestic partners attempt to claim equity in separately established enterprises." A pause. "She has a 90% success rate in those cases. And the 10%, cases where the founders made mistakes I'm quite certain you did not make." Margaret stood, put her reading glasses back on her head, and gathered the thermos. "Don't talk to Cassandra directly. Not about money, not about the business, not about Preston Vale. If she contacts you, tell her to reach your attorney." Rowan nodded. "And get your documentation in order. Founding documents, tax filings, account records going back to the business's origin, the building purchase, the property deed. Everything in a folder before you sit down with Diane." "Already started," Rowan said. Margaret looked at him over her glasses. "Of course you have," she said, with the tone of a woman who was not surprised. "Gil found what he found about Preston Vale the same way most things got found. Through people who knew people, in the quiet, informal network of contractors and tradespeople and subcontractors who worked adjacent to real estate transactions and talked among themselves about who was worth working with and who was not. Preston Vale had a particular business model. He identified historic properties in transitional neighborhoods, properties where ownership was often long-standing families or estates not fully fluent in the current market, and he moved to acquire them at pre-development prices before their value was fully established. This was not illegal in itself. What made it interesting was the question of how he knew which neighborhoods were transitioning before the market data made it public. Rowan met with Diane Ferris on a Friday at her office. She was 55, compact and direct, with a case file she had already built on the information he sent ahead. She walked him through the divorce filing first, the grounds, the asset schedule, the bank dispute. Then she placed a separate folder on the desk. "Tell me about Preston Vale and the courthouse project." Rowan described what he knew. The Hargrove County Courthouse was a historic landmark in a district that Rowan had heard, through the County Preservation Committee, was under consideration for a significant infrastructure investment. New transit access, mixed-use rezoning, the kind of public investment that multiplied property values in surrounding blocks. The courthouse restoration was part of a broader revitalization strategy. Diane was quiet for a moment. Who else would know about the infrastructure investment at this stage? She asked. County council members, planning commission, possibly some private stakeholders who have relationships with the planning office. Rowan paused. People who do property transactions for clients who are on those committees. Diane looked at him steadily. A paralegal at a property law firm whose clients include parties in that planning ecosystem. That is a reasonable inference, Rowan said. Diane made a note. Preston Vale, she said, has acquired 4 properties in that district in the last 18 months. 3 of them were purchased significantly below what those properties will be worth when the infrastructure plan is publicly announced. She set the notepad down. That acquisition pattern in the context of this timeline is the kind of thing that interests certain oversight bodies. I'm aware, Rowan said. Are you interested in reporting it? Rowan thought about this carefully, the way he thought about load calculations, where every force needed to be understood before you added weight. I'm interested, he said, in making sure that the truth of what happened is in the right hands, not for leverage, for accuracy. Diane looked at him with something that was close to approval. Then we proceed cleanly, she said. The divorce filing goes forward on the financial grounds. The $94,000, the fraud dispute at the bank, the full asset schedule including Decker restoration and the building, all documented correctly. Whatever happens with Mr. Vale's business practices is a separate matter for the appropriate authorities. She paused. But it will be on record. Yes, Rowan said. It will. The letter from Cassandra's attorney arrived 11 days after the divorce filing. Rowan was at the workshop when it came. He read it at his bench, standing, with the sound of Gil's hand plane running over a walnut board in the next room. The argument was what Margaret had predicted. Cassandra's household income had, for 4 years, provided the financial foundation that allowed Rowan to invest business revenue rather than draw it as living expenses. Without her income, the argument went, the business would have developed more slowly or required outside investment. Therefore, her contribution was material, and she was entitled to a share of Decker Restoration's current value. The number they proposed was $280,000. He read it twice. He did not feel the collapse that the letter was designed to produce. He felt instead the cold, specific clarity of a man who has just been shown exactly which way the wind is blowing and has already decided which way he is standing. He set the letter on the bench. He went to the doorway of the next room. Gil stopped planing. He looked up. They're claiming equity in the business. Gil set the plane down. He said nothing for a moment. Then, what's the number? Rowan told him. Gil was quiet. Then he said, she's never been in this room. No, she doesn't know what a mortise and tenon joint is. No, she couldn't tell you the difference between red oak and white oak on a visual inspection. No, she contributed to Decker restoration the way the weather contributes to a job site, Gil said. It was a condition. It wasn't a contribution. We need that on paper, Rowan said. Everything from the beginning, every dollar that came into this business and every source it came from. He picked up his phone. I'm calling Diane. The next 3 weeks were the hardest stretch. Not because Rowan doubted the outcome, but because clarity, even correct clarity, did not exempt you from the weight of it. He drove to job sites and worked with his hands, which was the best thing he knew to do when his mind needed to run a problem in the background. He came home to a house that still had all his things in it. She had taken what was hers and left everything else exactly where it stood, and found that the silence, which had first felt like damage, had gradually become something more like space. He called his mother twice. She asked him how he was sleeping. He told her honestly, better than he expected. She said that was the sign of a clear conscience, and he was inclined to believe her. He told the courthouse project team what was happening in the most minimal useful way. There was a personal matter requiring some legal attention. It would not affect his work schedule, and if anyone noticed he seemed distracted on a particular morning, he apologized in advance. The courthouse project team, who had worked with Rowan for 2 months by this point, received this information with the respectful matter-of-factness of people who had learned to trust that when Rowan said something was handled, it was handled. Diane submitted her response to the equity claim on a Monday. 47 pages. The business founding documents, which predated the marriage by 3 years. The original capitalization drawn entirely from Rowan's personal savings and a small business loan in his name alone. The tax filings from year 1, showing business income that exceeded household expenses from the second year of operation. The building purchase, which had been executed entirely from Decker Restoration's reserve account, with no contribution from joint or personal funds connected to Cassandra. And one additional document, a sworn statement from Gil Santos, Rowan's business partner and co-founder, detailing the founding of the company, its financial history, and the specific, documented absence of any material contribution, financial, operational, or strategic, from Cassandra Decker during the company's existence. The equity claim did not survive the filing. Cassandra's attorney withdrew it within the week. The language of the withdrawal was formal and gave nothing away, but Rowan understood what it meant in structural terms. The load had been applied. The wall had held. The bank dispute produced a separate set of consequences that moved more slowly but more permanently. The fraud investigation, once opened by the bank, proceeded on its own timeline. Rowan submitted the documentation Diane had assembled. 6 months of withdrawal records, the pattern of deliberate increments, the specific amounts and dates. The investigator assigned to the case was a careful woman named Mrs. Osment who called Rowan twice to clarify details and asked her questions with the precision of someone who had seen this particular pattern before. The total recovered would not be $94,000. Some of the withdrawals had been spent in ways that made them non-recoverable, but a significant portion, the most recent 2 months of withdrawals, which represented the largest single amounts, were tied to an account that had not yet been fully moved. $41,000 was frozen pending investigation. Rowan did not know this yet when he received the letter from Cassandra's attorney requesting a settlement conversation. He forwarded it to Diane without comment. He was at the courthouse site when he forwarded it, standing on the second floor of a building that had been waiting 11 years for someone who knew what they were doing. The plaster in the North Hall was original, 1888, horsehair and lime over hand split lath, and it had survived remarkably well in the parts where the roof had held. He was running his hand along a section near the window frame, reading the texture with his fingertips, understanding the state of the material the way his father had taught him to understand it. There were things you could only know by touch. The settlement conversation happened in Diane's office on a Wednesday afternoon. Cassandra came with her attorney. Rowan sat across the table from the woman he had married 4 years ago and understood, seeing her clearly for what felt like the first time in a long time, that he did not feel what he had expected to feel. Not anger, not grief, something quieter than both, something close to the feeling he had when he finished a structural repair and stood back and looked at it and understood it was correct. The thing was what it was. It would hold what it was supposed to hold. Cassandra's attorney opened with a number. It was a fraction of the number in the original equity claim, a compromise that assumed Rowan would want this finished, that he would value speed over precision. He drove to job sites and worked, which was the best medicine he knew. He restored a carved oak staircase in a 1904 house in the North District that had been covered in carpet for 40 years, working inch by inch to recover what was underneath. He repaired a historic plaster ceiling in a downtown building, where the original ornamental work was intact under 3 layers of latex paint, and spent 3 patient afternoons dissolving the surface accumulation to reveal the original detail. The courthouse contract moved forward. He drove out to Hargrove twice a week, walking the building in the early morning before the preservation committee arrived, reading the structure with his hands, making decisions about what could be saved and what had to be carefully replaced to match. The second floor framing along the north wall was original growth timber, still structurally sound after 136 years, dry and hard and honest. He thought in those mornings about what it meant to build something that outlasted the moment you built it in. The craftsmen who had framed this building had not known their names would be gone before the building was. They had just done the work correctly, because it was the correct way to do the work. He found this thought useful in ways he did not fully understand yet. Diane submitted the full documentation package for the divorce filing on a Wednesday. Rowan had spent the previous weekend assembling it. The business founding documents, tax records from year 1 through year 7, the building purchase deed, the account statements showing the separation of business and personal finances over the full duration of the marriage, the courthouse contract with its dollar amount clearly stated. He had written down the sum of what Decker Restoration represented. Business valuation, building, equipment, established contracts, client list. He had written the number on a single piece of paper and set it on the bench in the workshop and looked at it for a while. It was not a small number. It was the kind of number that came from 7 years of patient, correct work, one satisfied client referring another, one careful project building the reputation that brought the next one. Not luck, not leverage, just the accumulation of doing things right for long enough that the world noticed. Cassandra had noticed a carpenter who fixed old houses. She had seen the workshop and not known what it was for. She had heard the business name and not understood what the name was worth. She had lived for 4 years at an angle to what he was building and had not understood the load it was designed to carry. He thought about this without anger. He thought about it the way he thought about a structural failure on a job site. What failed, why it failed, what the correct approach would have been. Not to punish the structure, but to understand it. She had built her plan on a misunderstanding of the foundation. That was the sum of her mistake. On a Friday evening, 2 weeks into the waiting period before the settlement talks, Gil came by the workshop with takeout containers and a board game he had bought impulsively at a drugstore that he would never play correctly because he had already lost the instructions. They ate at the bench and argued about the rules for 40 minutes before abandoning the game and sitting in the comfortable silence of men who had been in each other's orbits long enough that silence was not a gap to fill. "You know what she didn't understand," Gil said. Rowan waited. She saw the sawdust and the old tools and the worn-out work clothes, and she made a calculation. Gil looked at the workshop around them, the organized tools, the seasoned lumber stacked along the wall, the current project in progress under its cloth cover. She calculated wrong. "Yes," Rowan said, "people look at hands-on work and they think it's small." Gil said it without heat. "My father heard it his whole life. Man with a trade is a man with limitations, people thought. Man in a suit is a man with a future." A pause. "My father died with a paid-off house and enough in savings to put 4 kids through college. The man in the suit he worked for went bankrupt twice." Rowan said nothing. "She calculated wrong," Gil said again. "And now she's going to learn the math." Rowan picked up his coffee. "She already is," he said. Diane said, quietly and without drama, that they would not be paying any equity claim, as the basis for the claim had been fully rebutted and withdrawn. She then laid out the bank dispute documentation, the fraud investigation status, the $41,000 currently in a frozen account, and the formal record that had been filed with the financial institution. The room was quiet. Cassandra was looking at the table. She was not the woman he had married exactly. Or rather, she was exactly the woman he had married, but he was seeing her more clearly than he had in 4 years. She was composed and precise and had been careful with her presentation today, the way she was always careful about the details of the impression she made. But there was something different now in the quality of her stillness. She was not calculating. She was not managing the room. She was sitting with the particular stillness of a person who has come to a reckoning they had not fully anticipated. He had thought about what he would say in this room. He had thought about it at the workbench and on the drive to job sites and in the early mornings at the courthouse when the building was quiet and his thoughts ran clearly. He had considered all the things he could say. The whole shape of it, the plan she had made, the precision of the withdrawals, the letter with its clean, careful handwriting, the empty hangers in the closet. He had decided that most of what he could say was not worth saying. What was worth saying was the truth. Rowan looked at her for a moment, and he said what he had decided to say. I don't want anything from you except what was taken. The money the bank recovers will be returned to the joint account and dispersed in the settlement. Whatever can't be recovered, I'll absorb. I'm not here to make this worse than it already is. He paused. But I need you to understand something. The business you thought was a hobby is worth more than everything you tried to take. The building I own, the courthouse contract, the client list, the reputation, none of that was on your radar. None of that was in your calculation. He said it plainly, not to wound her, but because it was true and it was the thing that needed to be said out loud. That is what I built, he said, while you were counting me out. Cassandra looked up. Something in her face had the quality of a person confronting a sum they had badly miscalculated. It was not exactly regret. It was something more specific, the look of someone who has understood, too late, what they had in front of them. She did not speak. Her attorney said they would review the counter terms. Diane said that was fine. Rowan picked up his jacket from the chair. He walked out of the office and stood in the elevator with both hands in his pockets and looked at the floor numbers descending. The weight of the last 2 months settled differently now. Not gone, but distributed correctly, like a structure that has been loaded and has found its equilibrium. Every joint holding, every element carrying what it was built to carry. The settlement terms came back within the week. Cassandra's attorney had reviewed the divorce filing, the asset documentation, the bank dispute record, and the full landscape of what Decker Restoration represented, and had apparently communicated to Cassandra, in the clear language of someone managing expectations, what the realistic outcome of continued litigation looked like. The final settlement awarded Cassandra no share of Decker Restoration, no claim on the workshop building, no portion of the courthouse contract. The joint account, including the $41,000 recovered from the fraud investigation, was split according to standard terms. The house was sold, the equity divided. She walked away with considerably less than she had planned to take, not because the law failed her, but because the plan she had built was constructed on a misunderstanding of the load-bearing elements. She had looked at Rowan's workshop and seen hobby work. She had looked at his business and seen small money. She had looked at the man and decided she understood what he was made of. She had been wrong in every direction. The week after the settlement was signed, Rowan walked through the house for the last time. He had listed it the morning the settlement was final, and the realtor had told him it would move quickly. The market in their neighborhood was good, and the house itself was in exceptional condition. It was in exceptional condition because Rowan had spent 4 years maintaining it the way he maintained everything. Correctly, completely, without cutting corners that would cost more later. He walked through it in the late afternoon light. He looked at the window casings he had refinished in the first year of their marriage, the ones with the minor detail work that nobody else would have noticed but that he had noticed and could not leave wrong. He looked at the kitchen floor, original tile from the 1940s that he had restored rather than replaced, because the original material was better than what you could buy now. He looked at the bedroom closet, bare on one side, his clothes still on the other. He stood in the kitchen for a moment in the specific light of late afternoon and thought about the sheet of paper that had been on the counter on a Tuesday in December. Her clean handwriting. The word sorry that did not reach far enough. He was not bitter. He had examined himself for bitterness the way he examined materials for flaw, carefully and honestly, and he had not found it. What he found instead was something simpler. He had been here in this house, building something while someone else counted him out. And the thing he built had held. The thing she had built had not. He turned off the kitchen light and walked out the back door for the last time. Preston Vale received a letter from the State Real Estate Licensing Board 4 months after the divorce was finalized. It cited concerns about the pattern of pre-announcement acquisitions in the Hargrove corridor and requested documentation related to several property transactions. The investigation was ongoing, quiet, methodical, the way investigations were when they were built correctly. He had not been charged with anything yet, but the letter was in his file now, and files had a weight of their own. Rowan drove to the courthouse site on a Saturday morning in February early, before the crew arrived. He parked in the lot and walked the building in the winter light. The exterior sandstone was responding well to the cleaning process. The original tooling marks were emerging from under decades of grime, precise and intentional. The marks of craftsmen who had understood they were making something that would stand long after them. He ran his hand along one of the corner quoins, feeling the interlocking fit, the way the pieces had been laid to distribute the weight of the walls above. Inside, the north hall was coming back to itself. The plaster repair was proceeding section by section, original formula lime mix, horsehair binder, the slow, patient process of matching materials to materials. The original pine floors were being consolidated and refinished rather than replaced. The window frames, hand-mortised at the joints, were holding well in the places where the roof had protected them. He stood in the center of the hall in the winter light coming through the cleaned windows and looked at what 11 months of careful work had produced, and felt the thing he always felt at this point in a restoration. Not satisfaction exactly, but recognition. The structure had been here all along. You were just removing what time had put over it. He heard footsteps on the exterior stairs, light and purposeful. The door opened. Nadia Kane had been the historical preservation officer overseeing the Hargrove Courthouse project since the beginning. She was 43, with a directness that Rowan had respected from the first meeting and a specific, rigorous knowledge of 19th-century construction methods that he had come to value in the way you valued someone who genuinely understood the work. She had appeared at the site most Saturdays since October, not because she was required to, but because she was someone for whom the work mattered beyond the official capacity of it. She stopped when she saw him in the hall. "Early," she said. "Always," he said. She walked to the center of the room and looked at the progress on the north wall. She had brought coffee in 2 paper cups, which she did most Saturdays, and she held one out to him without comment. He took it. They stood together in the hall and looked at the work. The light came through the restored window glass at an angle that caught the texture of the original plaster, the slight variations in surface that no modern machine could produce. "The horsehair sections are holding," she said. "Better than I expected," he said. "The original lime cured correctly. The problem was always the repairs they did in the 70s with cement-based compound. It didn't flex with the structure. The original material was designed to move." Nadia looked at him. "You say that like you knew them, the people who built it." He thought about this. "I know what they knew," he said. "Their knowledge is in the decisions they made, in how they laid this stone, how they cut these joints." He looked at the corner of the hall at the original trim work still in place along the ceiling. "They built this to carry weight for 150 years. They thought past their own lifetimes. That's a specific kind of understanding." She was quiet for a moment. "How are you doing?" she asked. Not casually, she was not casual about things. She asked with the directness she brought to everything. He thought about the right answer and decided the right answer was the true one. "Better than I expected," he said. "I'm learning something about what I built. The business. All of it. The business, the building. What I am when you strip off everything else." He looked at the plaster on the north wall, at the repairs that had taken 11 months to bring back to what they had been. "I was living next to someone who didn't see it, and I let that shape how I saw myself." Nadia was looking at him steadily. "What do you see now?" she asked. He looked around the hall, at the stone and the plaster and the original timber work and the light coming through clean glass into a room that had been waiting to be returned to what it was. "The same thing I built," he said. "I just see it clearly." They stood in the quiet of the hall and drank their coffee, and the building settled around them with the particular solid patience of a structure that had been built to last. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in April, 3 days before the first phase of the courthouse restoration was completed and inspected. Rowan was at the courthouse when Diane called him with the final word. He was standing in the south corridor with a clipboard, reviewing the inspection punch list with the project foreman, and he stepped outside to take the call and stood in the spring morning with the building behind him and the sky pale and bright and wide. Diane said, "Done." She said it the way she said everything, precisely, without embellishment. He thanked her. He meant it fully. He ended the call and stood there for a moment. Somewhere down the block, A delivery truck was backing up with the particular cautious beeping of large things moving carefully. Somewhere closer, a bird was working on something in the eaves of a neighboring building, purposeful and unhurried. He thought about $412 in a joint account. He thought about a woman who had looked at what he built and seen something worth stealing, and had not understood that the thing she could reach was not the thing that mattered. The courthouse building stood behind him, sandstone and timber, 136 years old and sound. He went back inside. There were people in Rowan's life who had been there without calculation, without condition, and without an exit strategy. The courthouse was finished in October, 11 days ahead of schedule. That fact registered with Rowan the way certain facts registered with craftsmen who kept track of the right things, not with celebration but with quiet professional satisfaction. 11 days ahead meant the work had been done correctly the first time, that the decisions had been made from knowledge rather than guesswork, that the materials had been respected. You did not finish ahead of schedule by rushing. You finished ahead of schedule by not making the mistakes that caused delays. He walked the building one last time before the final inspection, alone in the gray October morning, his boots on the original pine floors that had been consolidated and refinished to their correct depth, his hand trailing along the plaster of the north wall. He stopped at the center of the main hall and stood in the light coming through cleaned glass and listened to the building settle around him. There was a specific sound that a well-built structure made when it had been correctly restored, different from the sound of a new building settling and different from the sound of an old building in distress. It was the sound of something carrying its load properly, the subtle voice of wood and masonry doing what they had been designed to do. He stood there for several minutes. He thought about the first morning he had come to this building, alone before the County Preservation Committee arrived, pressing his palms against the sandstone at the base of the south wall. He had known then that the foundation was right. He thought about the morning he had come home to an empty closet and $412 in a joint account and a sheet of paper with his name in clean handwriting. He thought about a man sitting in a workshop late on a December night with both hands flat on the surface of a piece of white oak, staying with the weight of it until it was something he could work with rather than something that was working on him. He thought about Gil showing up with a key and a beer and no useless questions. He thought about Margaret Holt setting a thermos on the workbench and saying, "Tell me what happened," with the directness of a woman who understood that the most useful thing you could offer a person in a hard moment was clarity. He thought about a woman who had looked at all of this, the workshop, the work, the building, the contracts, the patient accumulation of 7 years of correct work, and had seen a carpenter who fixed old houses. She had not been wrong that he fixed old houses. She had been wrong about what that was worth. He had known then that the foundation was right. He had known the problems were surface problems, time and neglect, and that they were correctable. He had been right. He had been right about the courthouse, and he had been right about himself, and those two things were not separate. He picked up his clipboard and walked back toward the door. Gil Santos had been his business partner for 7 years, and in the year since Cassie left, he had done what he had always done, shown up, worked, said what needed saying, and left the rest alone. When the equity claim came, he had sat down at his bench with a legal pad and built the evidence for the counter-argument the same way he built furniture, methodically, completely, without shortcut. His sworn statement was 40 pages. Every date was correct. Margaret Holt had not billed Rowan for the conversation in the workshop, or for the 3 phone calls after, or for the review she quietly did of Diane's filings before she sent them forward. She said she was not practicing. She said she was just looking at papers. He knew what she was doing. He told her this once directly. She said, "You're restoring my house at cost because I told you it was meaningful work. We're even." He had not, in fact, been restoring her house at cost. He had been restoring it at the rate he would charge any client, but he understood what she meant, which was that she was not keeping score, and neither was he. April was a different thing, not from his past, but from a direction he had not predicted. Nadia did not hurry. She was someone for whom patience was not passive. It was an active quality, a decision. She appeared at the site on Saturday mornings, and then occasionally on Tuesday afternoons to review material questions, and then less occasionally at a lunch that was not about the courthouse project at all. And Rowan found that the particular quality of her attention, precise, genuine, willing to disagree on technical points without apology, was one of the most restful things he had encountered in recent memory. He told her this one morning over blueprints, which was not how he had planned to say it, but was honest. She looked at him with the expression of a person receiving information they have been expecting and decided to believe. "That's a very low bar," she said. "It is," he said. "I'm working my way up." She almost smiled. Preston Vale's licensing investigation continued its slow, patient arc through the official processes. A second investor, unrelated to Cassandra, came forward with documentation about one of the pre-announcement acquisitions. The board's case solidified. He was not in prison. He was not destroyed. But he was considerably smaller than he had appeared in the months when everything seemed to be moving in his favor. The institutional relationships he had depended on were under scrutiny. The acquisition model that had made him look prescient was now being examined for what it was. He was carrying the weight of it, every day. Cassandra had her sister's house and a job at a different firm, one that did not handle the kinds of clients who moved through the Hargrove corridor. She had made a plan for a life, and the plan had not produced the life. There were harder ways to learn that lesson, and there were easier ways, and what she had found was somewhere in the middle. Rowan's new apartment was on the third floor of a building in the district near the courthouse project, and he had chosen it for three things: the light from the east-facing windows in the morning, the proximity to the job site, and the fact that the original plaster walls had survived the building's renovation intact. He had told the landlord, when he took the apartment, that he would be doing some restoration work on the trim if that was acceptable. The landlord had said that was fine. The landlord had watched Rowan run his hand along the door frame of the apartment during the showing, in the way a doctor reads a pulse, and had understood that this man knew what he was looking at. The trim restoration took him 3 weekends. He did it on Saturday mornings when the light was right, with the radio playing low and the smell of linseed oil and fine dust filling the apartment, and he found those mornings to be among the best he had spent in recent memory. Just the work and the material and the quiet accumulation of something done correctly. Gil came once and looked at the trim and said, "You're going to spend more on this apartment than you'll make on rent savings." Rowan said, "I know." Gil looked at the original plaster walls, at the window casings newly restored to their correct profile. "Worth it," he said. He did not mean the money. They both understood he did not mean the money. Rowan did not follow Cassandra's progress. He heard things occasionally, through the same informal networks that had told Gil about Preston Vale. He registered what he heard without feeling much in either direction. The anger had burned through a long time ago, leaving nothing that poisoned anything. What replaced it was not forgiveness. He had no interest in that transaction. It was something more useful, the clear, unobstructed view of a man who had removed the thing that was clouding the surface and could now see what was actually there. The courthouse was finished in October, 11 days ahead of schedule, which was the first time in Decker Restoration's 7-year history that a major project had finished early. Rowan did not make a point of mentioning this to anyone, but he noticed it. The inspection was clean. Every original element that could be preserved had been preserved. Every repair had been executed in materials and methods consistent with the original construction. The county's preservation committee signed off in a meeting that lasted 30 minutes, which was the shortest approval meeting any of them could remember. Afterward, standing in the hall that had started as horsehair plaster covered in decades of institutional paint, and was now returned to its original surface, textured and warm and carrying in its variations the evidence of the hands that had made it. Rowan stood alone in the empty room for 10 minutes before the crew came in for the final walkthrough. He thought about the first morning he had walked this building, before the contract was signed, when it was still just a structure that had been waiting too long for someone who understood what it needed. He had walked the exterior and pressed his palms against the sandstone at the base of the south wall and felt the structural condition through his hands, the way his father had taught him. and known that the building was sound, that the problems were the problems of surface and time, not the problems of foundation. The foundation was right. Everything else could be brought back. He put both hands flat on the plaster of the north wall and felt the texture of it, the slight give of lime over lath, and thought about the men who had plastered this wall in 1888, who had known they were building something that would carry weight past their own lifetimes, who had understood that the standard of a thing was set by the care taken in the making of it. He thought about $412 in a joint account. He thought about a woman who had decided to take what she could reach and not understood that what she could reach was not the thing. He thought about a courthouse that had been waiting 11 years for someone who understood load and time and what a foundation was for. He was that person. He had been that person for a long time, building quietly in a workshop that smelled like cedar and linseed oil, while someone in the same house decided he was something smaller than what he was. He was not smaller. He never had been. He picked up his clipboard and walked back to the door. Outside, the October light was pale and clean, and Gil was standing by the crew van with 2 cups of coffee, and the courthouse was behind them with its sandstone face restored and its timber floors consolidated and its plaster walls returned to what they had been, and it would stand there now for another 100 years, holding its weight, exactly as it was built to do. What Rowan Decker had built could not be taken. It could only be understood. She had not understood it, and that was the sum of what she had lost. He walked toward the van. Gil handed him the coffee. They did not say anything for a moment. They just stood in the clean October morning and looked at what the work had produced. It held. That is what this kind of work does when it is done correctly and with the right materials and by the hands that understand the load. It holds. Longer than the person who built it, longer than the doubts of people who could not see the structure for what it was, longer than any single moment of damage or loss or miscalculation by someone who didn't understand what they were standing next to. If you know someone who has built something quietly for years while someone else counted them out, share this story with them. And if this reached you, leave your city below. Some things are worth knowing where they land.